Hello, and welcome to the new season of the Best Fleets to Drive For podcast. We have got a lot of very interesting things to talk about this season, and as is becoming our tradition, we're starting with our interviewers episode, where we're going to talk to the people that were involved in doing all of the interviews and scoring this year and get their perspectives. Once again, we've got a range of people that are doing it for the first time, some that have done it a few times, and some old people like me that have done it so many times they can't remember. So we're going to hear from all of them. And so we've got joining us today, Trish, who is our new Best Fleets program manager, who is going through the interview and scoring process for the first time. We also have Selassie, who oversees our partner relations normally, but he is joining the Best Fleets program for the first time as an interviewer and scorer. We have Tiffany, newly named our Director of Content Services, who has been an interviewer several times, and I think has probably realized that she doesn't need to keep doing this again. And Jane, who's been stuck in it for nearly as long as me.
But I'm not, well, actually, I'm older than you, so I can't say I'm not as old as you.
When it comes to Best Fleets, you're not as old as me, that's for sure. Yes. And we also have joining us partway through the meeting will be Rick, who is another part of the content team who was doing it for the first time too. So Rick is attending to another issue right now and will be doing a celebrity walk-on in a few minutes. So I want to start with where I always like to start on these is what were you expecting coming into it? And I'm going to start with Trish, since you started in this position just as the program was getting rolling, just as the nominations were opening up. And you went through that part of it, but the whole interview thing was brand new for you. So what were you expecting when you got to that point to start the interviews?
Well, I was expecting these casual conversations with people. I was looking forward to getting to know so many of the people who were involved. It in a lot of ways was what I was expecting. You got to talk to a lot of different fleets, hear a lot of great ideas, but in so many ways it was very different than I expected.
We're going to come back to that in a minute. So Selassie, what about you? What were you thinking it was going to be before you started it?
I mean, from going to different shows and having people come up and talk about Best Fleets, I knew it was an important program. I knew there was, a lot of energy around it. But when it came to administering and getting, interviews started, and I was not aware of how much was involved, the questionnaire wise, or how much some of the companies go into detail about what they're doing. So it was definitely caught me off guard, the amount of work that went in from the carriers. But I knew it was a big program, just didn't realize how important it was for some of the fleets out there.
Mm-hmm. And Tiff, you've been through it a few times. So what was going through your head as you got ramped up to do it again?
I was familiar with the amount of prep that it takes to interview somebody, so I wasn't taken aback by it. I knew what to expect going in. I was excited to see what's changed since last year and the year before. So this is my third year participating. And that was what I was most excited about. And I definitely did see, I feel, even though I talked to different carriers this year, I've seen the industry change since I've started, and things that were new when we were doing it a couple of years ago, everybody seems to be doing now. So I was looking forward to seeing what's changed, and I did end up seeing a lot of new things being done and older things that are now the standard, which is really neat.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And for those of you that were new, I generally go to a fair bit of effort to say that this is going to be a lot of work and don't plan on doing anything else during that time. So Trish and Selassie, did I effectively convey how much this was going to disrupt what you were doing normally?
You did. You warned us. You warned us a lot how busy it would be. But despite how much you warned us, it was even more. You have that thought in the back of your head, oh yeah, okay, it's going to be lots of work. It's lots of work, plus.
Yeah, Selassie?
Yeah, you warned us. The question is, did I listen? So I, I definitely did not adjust right away to what the expectations were, and it quickly caught up with me. So
Yeah.
I think,
Excellent.
Mark, I'm just going to jump in because you're never going to ask me a question. Um, that no one knows what it's like. Even the people who have seen the program for years and years and years, you do not get a real indication of what it's like until you do it. And you're in the middle of it and you're at all these fleets and you're trying to figure out where things like there's just no preparing people for it because it's way more involved than I think anyone. And we have been kind of the proverbial frog in the boiling water where it's just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger around us. And then so when even when we try to describe it, we can't do it. So when new people come on, it's like, what?
Yeah.
And
So, Rick, what was your experience, or what were you expecting, and how much work was it compared to what we thought you were going to be, or what you thought you were going to be doing?
Right. So I was ready to embrace the fact that there were a whole lot of things that I didn't know and that I didn't know I didn't know. And so you just kind of jump in and start swimming. Um, Intimidating at first, but once you get the rhythm of it, and if you can get a handle on sort of all those moving parts, it the car almost drives itself. You just got to make sure that your hands are on the wheel and that you're watching out for potholes.
Okay, so I'll throw this one out to all of you. What surprised you most about the experience this year? And anybody can jump in with their thoughts.
The last week.
And why? Why was the last week so surprising for you?
Yep.
Even as you went through about 6 weeks of interviews and prep, just that last week of the sheer volume of companies that book for the last week, that want to change their time in the last week, just that last week, there was no prepping for how insane it was.
Yeah.
So that last week was probably the most startling thing.
It's a just-in-time industry, isn't it?
So true.
Yeah. Anybody else? Anything else really surprising about the experience?
I think every year more and more people join in on the call. So instead of interviewing one or two people, now you're interviewing a team of people. And I feel like I've seen that grow over the past few years.
Yeah.
And it's also helped with the advent of like through the pandemic, everybody started putting in video conferencing tables. So everybody goes and sits at a video conferencing like at a table, and then they do video conferencing, and they're often like 50 feet away from you. So you know that you're on this big screen in front of them, but you see like these little tiny heads. And sometimes I've actually said, can you come closer? Because I can't see you. And that I didn't really, I kind of noticed it a couple of times, but I really noticed it this year. Everybody's got this conference room with video.
Yeah, I noticed that as well. And a lot of times the camera is kind of above the TV. So for us, it looks like we're in the ceiling looking down on these little tiny people. I feel like I'm looking at a little play set of people in there. But that comes to one of the things that really jumped out for me this year is everybody was video and everybody wanted their pictures afterwards. And that was something that we had started doing a couple of years ago, was taking the screenshot of the interview and sharing it with people for social media. And everybody wanted it this year. I cannot believe how many of those things we saw posted. It really was crazy.
And a shout out to Chris Henry, because he was the one who started that.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I want to give him a shout out. Curse you, Chris Henry. Now I have to be on video every time. I can't be on the phone slouching in my chair. I have to sit up straight for the entirety of the interview. It's hard work. So for those of you that were doing it for the first time, actually, this is a question for everybody. Do you remember anything from your first interview at this point?
I do. I remember sweating, being very nervous about it, feeling very uncomfortable for the first half an hour or so, and then just kind of relaxing into it and realizing it's just a conversation. My job as an interviewer is just to get the full story and give the interviewees a chance to go further with their answers. It's not really a high pressure environment. It's more of a relaxed conversation, like Trish said, and it's just talking to people.
Mm-hmm. I
And I
find
think
that usually about halfway through, I can't remember who my first interview was. And so, yeah, Rick, what were you going to say?
to pick up on what Tiffany was saying, that there's a certain point where you get that what you're trying to do is help them tell their story. And it's remarkable how many companies aren't sure how to do that. I mean, we're not going to do the work for them, but to get them to a place through that conversation where, you know what, tell me the story of your company. And then once you get that, it becomes less of an interview and more of a conversation.
Absolutely.
I remember my first interview. It was with Newsbomb, and the end. That's it. I don't remember who the second one was with. I have no idea. After that, the only reason I remember Newsbomb being first is because we had to do it early. And for some reason, I think I wanted to do it early so that I could do it for other people, like other people could be involved. Maybe Trish, you were on it? Were you on it? Okay. But that whole storytelling thing, what I noticed, and it's kind of related to what Rick was saying, is that people self-edit. I get a lot of people who are like, oh, I wasn't going to say anything about that. I'm like, why not? That's the best part. Don't, at least two fleets said, they said something and I said, oh, what about that? And then they would kind of laugh amongst themselves and say, oh, we weren't going to say anything about that. And where they kind of wreck the story, that they had a great story. They had way more life after I knew. I think it's what they called it. They had it, the people who were on the call had they called themselves the Justice League. And I was like, that's fabulous. But they didn't want to tell me that because they were a bit embarrassed.
Yeah, that's different. Yeah, don't come across many people with a Justice League inside their company. That's
well, maybe
awesome.
There's tons, Mark, and they're just not telling us.
Maybe they're all hiding it from us. Yes. Yeah. So what were the things that sort of stood out if you sort of look back on the interviewing process? What are the things that jump out for each of you, aside from the amount of work and what a poor job I did conveying to you how much work it was going to be? Anything else that jumped out? Selassie, I'll pick on you first.
I think there was a lot of initiatives around recruiting drivers. So one thing that surprised me was the amount of money that went to bonuses or, sign-on bonuses and how that'd be spread out over 6 months or a year. And I think, I don't want to say a lot of people were moving away from putting that money into, like recruiting and trying to go to like referrals. But I was seeing some of that in my interviews where they were trying to use their network, use their drivers to help bring in other drivers they knew and sweeten the pot in that way. So that was kind of interesting for me on seeing how different fleets were tackling the issue of, the driver shortage. But
Well, I guess for all of you that are doing interviews for the first time, you're sort of coming into the industry new as well, coming in from other industries. So seeing how trucking handles different situations is going to be fairly novel as well. Yeah. Trish, what about you?
Oh, there were so many things. There were things that were really unique. And sometimes you didn't realize how unique it was when you were talking to the company. Some things that really stood out for me when we talked about post-collision or infraction, the number of companies who talked about discipline or they talk about coaching, but so few said, we check on the driver. Mm-hmm. And that was something, the companies that said that, really stood out in my mind. The companies that said we have social events and we make sure everybody's involved, because even if they aren't stopping at the terminal, we send them something or we fly out to see them. There were really unique things happening at different companies. And the other thing was just companies that didn't tell you things. So kind of to Jane's point there, you'd be talking and they'd mention something and you go, tell me about that. They just don't, maybe they're just being humble, but you want to know their story. You want to get to know them. And the amount of information that you had to sort of pull out was surprising, because you want to know what they're doing and you want to know all the little details, and they think it doesn't matter, but it does.
Well, that kind of goes to something that Rick observed. So I'll ask you next, Rick. What were the things that jumped out for you?
I think the biggest thing is it's a word that you had used earlier, maturity, like fleet maturity, and how as you get more and more interviews under your belt, it's really clear that there's a perspective change from the fleet with respect to their drivers and how they see them. And sometimes how they're doing that is obvious. Sometimes you got to dig a little bit, but once you get a fuller picture of each one, it's really clear who's doing one kind of thing for the drivers, and how others have almost turned a corner in terms of their perspective, in terms of how they relate to their drivers.
So I'm going to come back to that when we move on to the scoring section, because I think that whole process it relates to what you're just talking about. But Tiffany, anything that jumped out for you?
I'd say there's probably two things that come to my mind right now. The first is that I noticed a lot of companies that I spoke to anyways had an increase in the number of female drivers. And that was really neat to me. So I always asked what sort of led to that increase. And a lot of really neat things came out of that. And mainly it was just companies paying attention to what female drivers need and want. So one company or one carrier said that they had a lot of female potential recruits calling and asking about a pet policy, and they didn't have one at that time. So they decided to implement one. And after that, they saw a huge increase in the number of female drivers that they had, because it makes them feel safer. And that wasn't even in their questionnaire. It was that they had the pet policy and that there was, a certain number of female drivers, but the two weren't linked. And hearing how they put that together and created a new and better environment to enable more female drivers to join them was really interesting. And I heard similar stories from a few other carriers. The second thing that jumped out to me was sort of the company culture and how a lot of carriers are putting more emphasis on their values and creating, like Jane said about the Justice League, creating programs or kind of divisions within their company or different ways to express those values. And I think that's really come through when I was talking to different carriers, how they, one, have invested in their values, and two, how they express them in different ways.
That's part of just to expand on what Tiffany is saying, I've always found that when company, and actually it kind of goes back to what Rick was saying, is that there is a real value to companies trying to brand themselves somehow, is figure out who they are and then figure out a way of telling people and taking those values and saying, okay, this is what we believe. This is the program that we're going to do that's going to display how we feel about drivers, and this is how we're going to make sure that it is working. But there's lots and lots of when you create programs that have names, that really, really helps. And even since like early on in Best Fleets, when Bison Transport, who's a Hall of Fame fleet, they would always do things like "You're safe with me," and that was, Garth Pitzel always has that on a pin on his jacket. That sort of, this is a belief that we have at Bison. And they have a program called Neighborhood Watch, which is exactly what you think it is that everybody keep an eye on everybody else and make sure that everybody is safe. Those kinds of programs, I know that ACT, American Central Transport, has one called Traction. That's their new entrant program. I think it's their finishing school. I can't remember exactly what it is, but they've called it traction, and play on words, traction of the tires, but also traction that's sticky. So this is something where you're going to learn how to be a driver, and it's going to stick. So I thought it was a really good name, good branding. And that, even though, corny branding, but it's not, it's really having names for things makes them familiar and gives you kind of a ways of talking to everybody on your staff about it, drivers and non-drivers. It's like a shorthand. And when people have shorthands within their company, that actually helps bring people together in a strange sort of way.
That's interesting. You're sort of pointing that out. And as you're mentioning that, I'm kind of going through them in my head. And I think all of the Hall of Fame fleets do that in varying degrees. So it isn't just a couple of companies, and it's certainly not just large companies, but I can think of all of the, of all of the Hall of Famers, I can think of at least one of those kind of programs at almost every one of them, just off the top of my head. So that
Nussbaum has their red.
COTC does it. FTC has done similar things as well. Halver has got those things. Prime has done lots of them. So, I'm sort of going through the list, and I was like, yep. So that really becomes part of creating that internal language, which becomes how they, like Rick said, sort of turn the corner on how they approach their drivers and communicate with drivers and that sort of thing. So that, and it's interesting. The things that jumped out for me pretty early on, I noticed that first off, everybody was really stepping it up a lot. There's been a lot of effort over the past year. And every year there's that effort, there's that incremental change. But this year it was really noticeable early on in the interviews. And certainly when we get to scoring, it'll figure in there as well. But even like with the first handful of interviews, it's like, okay, these people are really working it. And I also noticed, and maybe they're related, for the first time, a significant number of actual HR people that are part of the process. I mean, we've observed for years that there's next to no participants that have real HR backgrounds. They tend to be safety or driver services or hiring or sort of recruiting people, but not like true HR, like sort of people and culture kind of titles, or people operations, people development, sort of human capital management, those kind of titles. Finally, it's kind of showed up.
To interrupt, the HR, even when there were HR people, they would only be the non-driving staff.
Yeah, they weren't involved in the best fleets because they didn't have anything to do with the drivers. So that really changed. So I feel like those things are probably all related in one way or another, that sort of companies are maturing and getting their stories together. So let's pivot a little bit and talk about the scoring process, because that was certainly where we saw a lot of changes as well. And so I'm going to actually start with Tiffany on this one, because you wisely decided to skip out of the scoring part.
Yes, I did.
So let's talk a little bit about, you had been through it before, and what were the elements of scoring that you thought, I don't need to do that again? So sort of describe the process for us.
It's very, very tedious. And I used to be a teacher, so I'm no stranger to marking and scoring and assessment, but it's so rigorous, the amount of time and attention to detail that goes into scoring questions. So each question is scored on its own. So you're not scoring all the questions for one carrier, you're scoring one question for all carriers, and creating a evaluation rubric. We'll teach you
matrix.
Thank you. Evaluation matrix based on the results that you're seeing. And then using that matrix to go back and score all of the answers. And in between that, you've got spreadsheets with everything people are doing to try to create that matrix. And it's a really intense process for just one question. Will take hours and hours to score.
Yeah.
Which is why I opted out.
You did it once, you don't need to do it again. Okay. So I will pass that over then to the three of you that were doing it for the first time. What were you sort of expecting when you went into it, and where did it end up? Or what did you discover when you got there? And Rick, you're smirking first, so you obviously have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's
I
his
really-
natural face. Like that's
I
his
really enjoyed it.
resting smirk face.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it. Part of my background is just looking at large swaths of information and trying to figure out how to best organize it. And so to be able to take, God knows how many answers to a given question, and just sort of categorize how people are doing different things and look for categories and similarities was great. I was in my element. So I wish I'd had more of it. But I also came in a little bit late to scoring. So
Yeah.
uh,
Phrases rarely uttered in the scoring phase of the program.
it was super interesting. I may feel different next year, but
Yeah. Okay. So Lassie, what about you?
Oh man, scoring. It was an experience. You would I think at first when I was looking at it, it would be I would hope that their answers would align with the matrix that was used the previous year. But that was not usually the case. So you imagine you go through all the answers, think you have a pretty good scoring matrix ready, and then halfway through you're seeing this new thing that a bunch of the fleets are doing, and then you got to incorporate that and go back and see who you missed that might have mentioned they're doing that as well. So for each question you're trying to find out what's the new standard, and then from that new standard then see who's exceeding it. And it makes it, I think it's a very thorough process. It is definitely a long process, but it's thorough. You find your standard and then find out who's exceeding it, and it takes time. It's not a quick process at all. So
Yeah, and Trish, what did you find going through it?
Oh, I agree with all of that. The biggest thing that I found was I really appreciated companies who used bullet points and
Yes.
paragraph breaks
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
stayed on topic.
Yes, brevity, please. Yes,
Yes.
absolutely. Well, one of the things I always find interesting about it is it's a kind of it feels like a big, sharp right turn, because when you're going through your interviews, you're focused on this specific company and you're looking at all the things that they're doing. And then you focus on this other specific company. But we're at the point now where any of us may do 15, 20 interviews on the outside. It's a small portion of the fleets that we're actually getting to talk to. It's only when you get into the scoring where you see all the answers for that particular question from all of the fleets that you really start to get a sense of what's actually happening in that specific area. And it might be that some of the companies that you really enjoyed interviewing don't actually have a standout answer. When you see all of the other answers there together, sometimes you're like, oh, well, this actually is going in a different direction and it needs to be scored in this particular way. So that's something that I always really find fascinating about it, is I think about the people that I scored that were sort of standing out to me as I went through the interview process, and then how does that shape up when you actually get to the scoring? So it's always interesting to shift it that way. But did any of you find anything that really jumped out at you that was something sort of noteworthy in the scoring or challenging? Open
Opposed
field
to
there.
all of it.
Yeah, yeah. Or is it just such a blur that you can't remember any of it?
Well, I have one thing that I wanted to say, and Trish, then we'll go back to you. There's a big difference in how well the conversation goes and how a company scores, because it really depends on the type of personality in the interview. And you don't have to be good at interviews or particularly personable or fun to talk to. People who are fun to talk to often do terribly in best fleets. It really is about, so you don't necessarily, I think fleets make the mistake of thinking, okay, this guy or the owner of the company is really, what's the word for, have a lot of personality and
a lot of charisma.
Yeah, charismatic. Yeah. And so, yeah, let's put that person in, and that person doesn't answer any of the questions that you have. They're a great person to talk to, but they're not informative at all. So when you get to scoring, and sometimes in my head, I'm thinking, okay, you're not telling me anything. Oh, so either you don't know or you don't want to tell me anything. And there's only so much you can push. But then in the scoring, it totally comes out, because the people who give you the information, way easier to score. The people who have just fluffed around and had a really fun conversation with you, there's nothing there.
Yeah, there are times when you look at it and it's like, I really enjoyed this conversation and I want to give them something, but I just don't,
There's nothing
don't have
there.
anything to work with. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, Trish, did you have a comment on that?
Oh, I was going to say on just on what Jane just said, it amazed me how many interviews started and the people you were interviewing were so nervous. And so when we first started interviewing, I found, okay, I'm nervous and they're nervous. And so you started saying things like, it's just a casual conversation. Let's just get to know you. And it seemed to, you could see as the interview progressed, like they got calm and they realized, okay, this isn't a painful process. And, you know, you're not going to grill me on numbers. And it was in their wheelhouse. It made them more comfortable if you had the right people in the interview. But just the nerves that they had in the very beginning, it surprised me. But I was going to say, in the scoring, the new entrance program, what do you have for new entrants? That question was the one that just, oh, it was tough. It was all over the place in how people answered it. There was just the sheer volume of options. Like Selassie said, you thought you had a matrix, then it was gone. Like it was all over the place. And that was one where I ended up going to Jane and I'm lost. I thought this was really good, but then they're doing this, but I don't know what this is. And so some of the questions, you literally could spend the entire day on it. And you're looking at 95 answers from companies. You're looking at all of your interviewers' notes. You're bringing up things from last year. It was intense.
Yeah, I was going to ask what the hardest question was to score.
That was one of that question is going to change next year, I think, just because everybody's doing new entrant programs now. So we have to get specific about, you know, who you're providing it to, what happens with coaching. Like we're basically having to drill down now.
Selassie, what did you find was the hardest question to score? Which one took you the longest and went through so many things?
Sorry, I'm actually trying to see if I can
it's all
pull up some of those notes I had.
He's moved on, Mark. He's moved on. It was traumatic.
He parked them all.
Which there was one I really struggled with. I don't know if it was actually, I'm looking at the matrix for onboarding. There was just so much involved with how different fleets what they had with the onboarding process. So I think that's one where I had
that was your version of the new entrant.
10 different things that was being measured, and you start off maybe with 4 of them, 5 just kept growing and going back and forth. But I mean, from seeing the range of answers, I think it does speak to what the fleets are trying to do. It's not, onboarding is not something that's simple and easy. Obviously, I've never been in that position with, a fleet to see what they have to do to train and keep drivers, but I can at least tell from this round of best fleets that they are trying, they're experimenting, and they're trying to get that right mix to make sure they're keeping people on board.
So when we go through the scoring process, we generally will start with the previous year's matrix just to see, does it align? And maybe you get lucky and everything sort of fits in there and you don't have to change it. But in almost no cases this year did that end up happening. Almost every case we ended up having to change it. And once you realize that you have to change it, which is normally about a half to, in worst case scenarios, you're about 2/3 of the way through when you're like, yeah, this just isn't working and you've got to go back. And at that point, you kind of go back to the drawing board and you have to start pulling out everything that people are doing. So you take all of these answers and pull them into a spreadsheet and sort of convert it into a common language so that all of the answers for every different fleet, regardless of how they wrote it or what they said, gets converted into something that you can then put into a spreadsheet and start comparing with others. And that's the process where you can end up with 8 or 10 different columns of things that you're looking at for each different company. And then at the end of that, you got to figure out, okay, well, now we know what everybody's doing. We know who's doing what. How do we score it? How do we determine what's a low score or a moderate score, or what's going to be a high score, what's encompassing that? And then every time you get to that point where you've got that figured out, there's a few outliers that don't really fit into any of those categories. So they've got a lot of this, but they don't have as much of this. Or they've got, man, they're kind of deficient here, but they're making up for it in other ways. So you end up having to go through that process. And that's what eats up a lot of that time. That's what ends up taking an entire day going through one single question. So yeah, it is definitely a challenging experience. Rick, what stood out for you?
I'm just looking at coaching and mentoring right now, and that was one of the ones where you think you've got a handle on it, but then there are some things that other companies are doing, and where exactly can that be categorized? But to loop back on what was said earlier, when you're going through it, the thing that's out is personality's gone, and you will remember those great conversations, but you're looking at the answer and you're like, it's just not there.
Personality is like a veneer on top of the questionnaire,
Mhm.
and it makes it more pleasant, but it's not necessarily an advantage, I think.
Mhm.
That
Because
seems right.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I really just only started thinking about that during this conversation, is that personality is really not like, when you're scoring, you're going to the absolute, you're just going to what they say and none of the fluffy words around it. And when you boil it down, it ends up, it has nothing to do with how engaging the conversation was. It just has to do with the information.